Hi, it's Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, on a Shushan Purim. And I hope everyone had a lovely Purim and celebrations are continuing in Yerushalayim on Shushan Purim. But we are going to be studying today Moreh Nevukhim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. We are continuing in section 3, and we are currently beginning chapter 33. I also want to apologize. My understanding is that because daylight savings time has already been set for the Western Hemisphere and has not yet taken place in Israel, there is an hour discrepancy which seems to, for this platform, preclude some people from being able to get online. But you will be able to watch this shir recorded on the webyeshiva.org platform, as well as on the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. So we are in the using the Shlomo Pines edition. We're on page 532, and we are about to embark on a continuation of the Rambam's discussion of Ta'amei HaMitzvot, of helping us understand what exactly God had in mind when he gave us a corpus of commandments to help guide us and lead our lives. And what the Rambam has essentially concluded as an Aristotelian philosopher is that the function of the mitzvot is to help us reach the goal of any Aristotelian, which is to reach intellectual perfection. And for the Rambam, there is no inconsistency between the project of philosophy and the project of the Torah, which is to obtain absolute and perfect knowledge of God first, and then the entire universe second, which is a reflection of God's will and God's manifestation. So, with that in mind, I'd like to share my screen with you, which is the handout for today. As we always announce, you can always find these handouts in one of two places. One is on the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and the other one is on the webyeshiva.org website. It is attached to the course description for this chapter that we're learning today, which is section 3, chapter 33. And we've entitled this chapter Holiness, the definition of that word, Kiddusha, and restraining one's physical desires. Just to get our bearings and to see where we are, in the previous chapter, we learned how idolatry and its practices detract the individual from achieving intellectual perfection. And that is why the Torah focuses so much on the sacrificial order, on the offering of korbanot, in the hope of weaning the practitioner away from idolatry, because idolatrous sects at the time when the Torah was given used those very practices for idolatry. And so God, in his effort to pull us away from idolatry, told us to bring korbanot to God instead of korbanot to the various different deities that were prevalent in the ancient world. The Torah is also concerned about pulling a person away from physical drives. Just as idolatrous practices detract one's intellect from the proper goal, so does the pursuit of one's lusts detract the person away from both intellectual and physical perfection and health. And that's really going to be the theme of our parsha. The theme of our chapter. Once the Rambam in the previous chapter, chapter 32, has explained to us how really part and parcel of these mitzvot is to help guide us towards reaching intellectual perfection by making sure that we steer clear of certain unhealthy activities and unhealthy mindsets which will prevent us from achieving that intellectual perfection. The Rambam has already covered that in his discussion of the sacrifices and God pulling us away from idolatry, which is an ideological system which is antithetical towards the achievement of intellectual perfection and a perfect knowledge of God. That's the reason why idolatry is so dangerous, not because God is a jealous God, so to speak, the way that he's described in the text, but rather because if a person pursues the worship of multiple deities, then that will prevent the individual from achieving intellectual perfection and knowing God as he truly is. And that would sort of defeat the whole purpose of one's existence if one wasn't able to achieve that project. In the same vein, we now go to this chapter, which carries over that very same idea. Not only are there unhealthy ideologies that detract the person from fulfilling their perfected intellect, but there are certain physical indulgences which prevent a person from achieving intellectual perfection. If a person spends their life as an Epicurean, as a hedonist, as someone who is trying to just find the best aesthetic indulgence of this world, so then invariably that person will not be able to use their life in the pursuit of intellectual perfection, because the first will detract from the second. And that's really the whole theme of this chapter. It's not a long chapter. We should be able to cover it relatively quickly. But let's go through the outline. And he says one of the overarching goals of the Torah is to detract a person from the pursuit of his physical desires. And specifically, and it's interesting to note that the Rambam puts these all in the same category: eating, drinking, and sexual intercourse. Over the centuries, the Jewish people have, I guess perhaps based on many influences within our society, have recognized that the importance of sexual chastity. But when it comes to eating and drinking, perhaps not so much. We know that the Torah limits what we can eat and what we can drink. There's a limit placed on what kinds of foods. They have to all be kosher. They have to, right? But when you go to the supermarket today, the kosher supermarket, and you see all of the products available, and you see all of the cooking shows for kosher food, and you see all of the things that are available to us to really spend an entire life with, even kosher Jewish magazines that are devoted to the culinary experience. One would have to sort of look back to the Rambam and say, Rambam, what is your attitude towards a magazine or to a periodical or to a show that is dedicated to the pursuit of finding the best food possible to eat? The Rambam would look at that and he would say, well, that's no difference from having a magazine or a show describing for you the best way to pursue sexual pleasure. He would say that those things are really not appropriate for a Jew to pursue and to spend a lot of time on, simply because these things pull us away from the ultimate goal of really the knowledge of God. Lust harms a person's intellect, which is the ultimate goal, and lust also harms a person's physical well-being, which is the secondary goal. Now, what we mean as the first goal and this, or the ultimate goal and the secondary goal, goes back to chapter 27, where the Rambam writes that overall, the Torah's project presents us with mitzvos that help to keep our bodies healthy. And the reason why our bodies need to be healthy is because you can only have a healthy mind if you have a healthy body. Well, when one focuses on physical indulgence, that has two negative effects. It will detract the person from trying to pursue the intellectual pursuits, and furthermore, it will compromise the health of a person's physical body, because if you overindulge, you become either an alcoholic. If that's your indulgence is in alcohol, you will become a diabetic. If your pursuit is sugar, you'll become overweight and obese and sluggish, and those will inhibit one's health, one's physical health, preventing them from being able to carry out the ultimate intellectual goal. So this is because it also harms social structures within a society. Now, how does the pursuit of the physical harm social structures? And this is a very important idea, which I think has ramifications to our social structures today. And the reason why this harms social structures is because when only one's desires are followed, and one views the pursuit of physical pleasure as the ultimate goal, as is done by ignorant people, the following occurs. Number one, man ceases to focus on speculation, which is the ultimate goal. Number two, man's body is corrupted through his vices. Number three, because man's body becomes unhealthy and sluggish, a person will tend to die before his time due to his overindulgence. And if a person dies before his time, life is a finite amount of time, and you really need a full lifetime to be able to reach that intellectual perfection goal. So if a person was meant to live, let's say, 80 to 90 years, and because of his indulgence in physical things, he only ends up living 60 to 70 years, God forbid. So then he's run out of runway to be able to attain that intellectual perfection. So that's another problem. And finally, this results when a person pursues only the physical desires, it results in an increase of worry and sorrow, as well as jealousy, hatred, conflict, and taking that which belongs to another. And ultimately, that's bad for our social structures. If everyone's just looking to take and indulge, then where is the commonality within society where we work towards common goals together and we share resources with each other, right? It creates a selfishness within society, and that also contributes to the erosion of the general body politics health. And so overall, the emphasis on physical indulgence, which might be reflected upon in our society today, really results in multiple negativities, all of which will ultimately pull man away from the ultimate project of intellectual perfection. God therefore gave us the mitzvot that steer us away from indulging in our physical desires. And that's not all the mitzvot, but certainly a significant subset of mitzvot are were put into place to help man loosen his attachment to the physical. These mitzvot steer us away from thinking about our physical desires and prevent those things that bring a person to lust by creating proper structures and safeguards in place so that a person doesn't fall into any traps. One need only look at the Ben Sorer Moreh described in Deuteronomy chapter 21 when two parents find that they have a 13-year-old son whose behavior is very unhealthy because he's constantly indulging in gluttony of eating meat and drinking wine. And they realize that this child is eventually going to grow up to become a very selfish and rapacious personality. So that's a lesson in putting to death someone who has completely succumbed to their physical desires. The Torah says that the parents should bring their 13-year-old child to the Sanhedrin, provide evidence that the son has stolen from them and has completely disregarded any kind of efforts at rehabilitation and discipline of the child and continues his gluttonous behavior. And the Torah says that the Sanhedrin puts this child to death. It's interesting. This is one of those few cases where we say that an Adam is nidon al shem sofo, that he is judged not based on what he's doing right now. That what the child has done does not make him deserving of the death penalty, but we anticipate that because of this negative trajectory that this child is going on, when he becomes an adult, he's going to become much worse. The Torah's command is to proactively remove him from our midst even before he becomes too corrupted. This is because the Torah recognizes how powerful lust is in its ability to destroy other people's lives. And as the Mishnah itself says, Ben Sorer Moreh Nidon al Shem Sofo, Yamut Zakai Va'al Yamut Chayav. Better that he should die in a state of relative innocence than die by allowing him to wait to grow up, commit murder, harming other people, and then being put to death because he committed so many heinous acts. And the Mishnah says, Shemitatan shel rishaim hana'a lahen v'hana'a le'olam. Because when the dead die, when the wicked die, that is actually beneficial for them because it prevents them from continuing along their negative behavior. And it also brings benefit to the world by preventing a rotten apple from corrupting others and harming others as well. And so that's the whole theme of a Ben Sorer Moreh, that a person who is completely given to indulgence and has succumbed completely to their lustful desires not only ends up harming themselves, but ends up harming society as a whole. And that's why it's such a negative influence. This idea of hedonism has such a negative and caustic influence upon the Torah community. And so just as an aside, I think many of us know what the Gemara says: Ben Sora umore lo haya velo yihya. There never was a case of a Ben Sora umore historically, and there never will be, because all of the very technical criteria that are placed upon two parents to be able to bring their child to the Sanhedrin, the Talmud limits it severely. But even more than that, what parent would be able to have the callousness and the lack of compassion to bring their child to be executed in the Sanhedrin? So the Gemara then asks, what then is the purpose of this mitzvah if it's never happened and never will occur? The answer is drosh v'kabel sachar. The purpose is to be able to understand the nature of this mitzvah and receive the reward from that study. And the way it would seem that the Rambam is understanding this is that he acknowledges that in practicality, this case of a ben sorer Moreh never took place, but the lesson that we can learn from the story of the ben sorer Moreh and how much the Torah cares about an individual not indulging in their lusts is really the important lesson here. Next point, the refinement takes place from certain mitzvot by way of refining man's character. In other words, there are a whole set of commandments that seek to destroy those aspects of the human character and various different personality traits that will allow a person to be given to physical lusts by making him responsive, obedient, of settled mind, and civil. I used different words from the Pines edition. I just wasn't happy with some of the words he used. Some examples in scripture that point to God's desire for this refinement, the Rambam now quotes a number of psukim. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, it says, Umaltem eit orlat levavchem. You shall circumcise the impurity of your heart, or the foreskin, literally, of your heart, being a reference to the idea that man has a tendency towards lusts and indulgences, and the Torah exhorts man to be able to curb his appetite. As it says, Hasketu Shema Yisrael in Deuteronomy 27, that pay attention and listen, O Israel. God is constantly directing us to lift up our eyes from our own indulgences and to pay heed to the word of Hashem. As it says in Isaiah chapter 1, Im tovu ushmatem, that if you pay attention and you listen, then tuv haaretz tochelo, only then will you be able to enjoy the goodness of the land. Or as the Jewish people, in reference to Israel's accepting God's commandments, the Jewish people themselves say, Vishamanu ve'asinu. We will hear, we will pay heed, and we will do the mitzvot. Really, you see this theme recurring throughout Tanakh, that the idea that the Jewish people are meant to pay attention to the commandments, to lift away their gaze from their personal indulgences and focus on serving God. And that causes man to become more obedient and responsive to the will of God, thus tearing him away from those character traits which would make him more selfish and self-indulgent. And as it says metaphorically in the Song of Songs, in Canticles, chapter 1, Moshcheni acharecha narutza, God, when you pull me, I will run after you. This refinement further takes place by pulling man away from sexual activity, which is not just the perfection of one's attitude, but also takes corrective measures against his behaviors, making it as infrequent as possible, the ability to have access to sexual indulgence, as I shall explain later. We'll see when we get to chapter 49. The Rambam will talk about the various different mitzvot, such as the mitzvah of circumcision and the laws of nidah, which were designed to curb man's sexual appetite. This is what causes man to achieve two terms that we find in the Torah, both tahara and kedusha, purity and holiness. Now, the Rambam is not going to dedicate himself in this chapter to define the exact difference between those two words, so we can assume that he's going to be using them synonymously, at least for our purposes in this chapter. That the very outset of the giving of the Torah, we find an example of this kind of project of God detracting the Jewish people away from sexual activity. Because in Exodus chapter 19, the Torah states that God told Moshe to tell the nation to prepare for 3 days at Mount Sinai in order to hear the word of God. And what was that preparation? Hayu nechonim l'shlosh yamim, be prepared for 3 days. Al tigishu el isha, no man may come in physical contact with a woman. What you see from here is that this indicates that holiness is accomplished to be able to hear the word of God. You accomplish that through sexual abstinence. Now, of course, this has to be taken in proper context. Judaism does not advocate celibacy in order to achieve holiness. It does, however, advocate curbing one's sexual activity. So we'll get more into that when we get into the ensuing chapters. I just want to, before we go any further, compare what the Rambam is saying, that holiness is described in terms of sexual chastity, and abstinence is what Rashi actually tells us in the beginning of Parshat Kedoshim, Leviticus chapter 19. The Torah gives us a commandment: "You shall be holy." So first, it starts off by saying, "Daber el kol adat b'nei," so speak to the entire community of Israel when you give them this commandment of being holy. Rashi tells us that when Moshe gave these commandments, starting off with the commandment to be holy, it was given in the context of assembling all the people together. And the reason is mipnei sherov gufei Torah tuluyin ba, because so much of the fundamental foundational aspects of the Torah are tied into the commandments that start off with the commandment to be holy. So obviously being holy is a very overarching principle of the entire Torah. But it could be that for the Rambam, the reason why the people were gathered together is because of this acknowledgement that this is a social ill, not only an individual ill. If society as a whole becomes hedonistic, then it will cause a breakdown within the social fabric as well. And that could be the reason for the Rambam as to why Moshe gathered all the people together. The mitzvah of being holy is not just an individual imperative, but it's also a social imperative so that society remains healthy. And where do we know that this idea of being holy has to do with a sense of chastity? Because Rashi tells us, what is the definition of kedoshim tihiyu? Hevu prushim min ha'arayot min ha'avera, that separate yourselves from forbidden sexual encounters and from any kind of sexual sinfulness. Shekol makom sha'ata motzei geder erva, any time you find the Torah creating some kind of restriction on sexuality, ata motzei kedusha. That is where you encounter holiness. Many times in modern nomenclature, people throw around the word holy in very inappropriate ways, because anything can be holy if you are inspired at that moment. I was at a holy event. I felt holiness in this place. Yes, well, was the holiness real, or was it just an emotional response to something that was heartwarming? According to Rashi and the Rambam, holiness has a very specific definition, and that is the creation of restrictions on sexual activity. And so, what some people might consider holy may be the antithesis of holiness, because a person might incorrectly say, well, wherever there's love, there's holiness. Not necessarily. If the love is something that is restricted, if the love which manifests in physical activity is that which is forbidden by the Torah, then you can't say that that's holy. You can say that it's heartwarming. You can say that it represents love between two parties, but it's not going to be defined as holiness. Now, that's not the only definition of holiness for the Rambam. Any kind of abstinence from physical indulgence, not just sexual indulgence, as we mentioned at the outset of the chapter, is also considered to be kedusha, according to the Rambam. And therefore, he says that that's the reason why when the Torah talks about the Nazirite, the Nazir, and discusses his abstinence from wine, he is called kadosh, as it says in the book of Numbers, chapter 6. He then cites a midrash called the Sifra on the verse in Leviticus chapter 11. Vihit kadishtem, vihitem kedoshim. You shall sanctify yourselves, and you shall be holy. And the Rambam says that this idea of sanctifying oneself works out very well according to my definition of what holiness is, because it is an imperative upon the individual and on the society to actually proactively work on this effort to be holy. You can't just assume that holiness is a state of mind. It does require action, and that action is defined as lihit kadesh, to sanctify yourself through restricting your sexual encounters, through restricting your physical indulgences in food and drink. Now, it's interesting, and we're not going to have time to go into this to any great detail, but the Rambam ends up misquoting the Sifra. The only part that the Rambam says that the Sifra says is Kedushat Kol HaMitzvot, that there's a holiness built into all of the physical commandments because the commandments themselves help us restrain ourselves and restrict ourselves from physical indulgences. However, what's curious, if you look at the original text of the Sifra, that's not really what the Sifra says. It says that the text in Leviticus chapter 11 of Vihit Kadishtem Vitem Kedoshim refers to separating oneself from any kind of idolatrous practice. And then it says, I know that because the previous commandment of you shall be holy, which is contained elsewhere in the Torah, it says, Harei Kedushat Kol HaMitzvot Amura. In Leviticus 19, when it says generically be holy, that's referring to engage in all of the mitzvot in general that help you restrain physical activity. How then do I know of vihit kadishtem vihitem kedoshim refers to something else? Because otherwise the Torah would be repetitious. So essentially, the Sifra is telling us that this particular verse refers to the ultimate sin, which will detract the person from finding perfection, and that's the indulgence in idolatrous practices and ideologies. So it could very well be that the reason why the Rambam misquotes this is because he's really giving us a nod to his understanding that even though physical abstinence is important, it's really not an end unto itself. It's a means towards a greater end of achieving intellectual perfection. What is the more direct route to achieving intellectual perfection? Abstaining from any ideological pursuits which are completely erroneous, which will lead you down a wrong intellectual path. That's what idolatry is really all about. So I'm not going to get into, I won't discuss this in any greater depth, but I just wanted to point out that the Rambam seems to be misquoting the Sifra with purpose. Conversely, the Torah identifies the transgression of mitzvot as tuma, as what the antonym of purity, of tahara, is tuma. And so tuma is the antithesis of both kedusha and tahara. And I will explain this later, why the Torah compares ritual impurity to the transgression of the commandments. Now, then the Rambam talks about the idea of physical cleanliness. And he says that there is a subset of the commandments that is designed to keep our bodies clean as well as our ideologies and our behaviors. They all are part of this chapter that the Rambam says the whole purpose of this chapter is to explain to us how a certain subset of mitzvot were designed to help deter us from doing things that are unhealthy indulgences in our bodies. And so part of those mitzvot curb our attitudes and develop good character traits. Another portion of those mitzvot restrict our behavior from becoming overly hedonistic. And finally, a certain subset of the commandments, and the Rambam hasn't told us what those were yet, but they certainly have to do with immersing oneself in a mikvah, doing an ablution, an immersion in water to help keep ourselves physically clean. That is also part of this, because the Rambam believes that physical cleanliness and the separation from anything that is dirty helps us achieve that objective of removing ourselves from physical indulgences and sort of elevating ourselves from the earthly things in our environment that can help pull us down and pull us away from our intellectual pursuits. But the Rambam says one has to be very careful about this subset of mitzvot that are dedicated to physical cleanliness. This physical cleanliness is only secondary to the purification and cleaning of one's actions, the laws against sexuality, and one's heart, the laws that refine one's attitude, from polluting opinions and moral qualities. This is so because to cleanse only one's exterior, one's clothes, and one's body, while at the same time possessing lust for food and intercourse, is particularly abominable because, and the Rambam says one has to be very careful because when you give across an external presentation of oneself that shows I am clean, I am pure, my clothes are clean, I am properly groomed, and I am properly cleansed, but internally you are still filled without those character traits that are negative, and you're still filled in secret with physical indulgences that your waistline betrays. So then that's particularly abominable because there's a certain hypocrisy. In addition to the fact that you haven't really done the main work, you are also pretending to be something that you are not. And that is why Isaiah said in chapter 66, Hamit Kadshim v'Hamit Taharim, those who sanctify themselves and present themselves as completely pure, El Haganot, will retreat to the gardens. Achar achat batavech. And those words are a little bit difficult to translate, but it really seems to mean that they go to a private little pool of water back in the backyard where no one can see them. Ochlei bisar hachazir, and it's there where they indulge in the eating of pig meat, v'hasheketz v'ha'achbar, and all manner of disgusting foul creatures and mice. Yachdav yasufu, Ne'um Hashem. That is where they together will continue their sinfulness, says the Lord. And this is what is particularly disdainful to God. And Rambam even says that the words achar achat batavech, going and getting into a swimming pool, like the Radak says, may refer to forbidden sexual activity. And as the Radak explains, it's because how do you get into a swimming pool? Well, if you go with mixed genders into a swimming pool, you're going to have to remove your clothing. And that's where people go to perform acts of licentiousness, go out into a private swimming pool with mixed genders and to be able to engage in all form of forbidden sexual activity. Essentially, the verse refers to people who outwardly appear pure and holy, but privately succumb to their lusts for food and sex, pleasuring their bodies. This is not the objective of the Torah. The primary objective is to restrain desire, and the purification of the exterior, thus, should only come after the purification of the interior. About such hypocrites, King Solomon said, people who pretend to be externally pure, but really internally harbor those same feelings and lusts and activities which are indulgent. Dor tohor be'enav, umitzo ato lo ruchatz. It says in Proverbs chapter 30 that a generation may be pure in its own eyes, but it really has not cleansed itself from its filth. Dor maramu enav. Such a generation has lofty eyes. It lifts up its eyes in pride. Ve'afapav yinaseu, even its eyelids are lifted up, thinking to itself, oh, I am so pious and holy, and I lift myself up to the heavens, when in reality, I have not done the work that I need to do in order to purify myself. And the Rambam concludes this chapter, as he does many chapters, he says, once you consider these intentions I have mentioned, many of the law's reasons will become clear to you, and I will elaborate upon the individual commandments in the ensuing chapters. Now, we are not there yet to break down the individual commandments yet. We're going to do another couple of chapters of work, but this is really a necessary step. Once we've established that idolatry is the closest thing to detracting one from intellectual perfection, we then saw in today's chapter how indulgence and attitudes that lead to indulgence of one's physical desires also contribute to that detraction from the ultimate project of intellectual perfection. And now we're ready to go on to another idea, which we'll see in chapter 34. I hope to discuss it with you next time. By next week, our clocks will have been aligned, and so hopefully we won't have the problems that we had today for people to join the Shir live. And I look forward to seeing you then. Okay, let me wish you all a good week. and we will see you Bezrat Hashem soon. Take care.